The truck rumbled to a halt, the canvas flap thrown back to reveal the grey rain-slicked mud of a holding area near Cherbourg. For 22-year-old Helga, a Wehrmacht Selfrin female auxiliary attached to a German field hospital, this was the moment she had been praying against for months. She stepped down, her legs trembling, clutching a small rucksack that contained her entire life. Around her, other nurses and female auxiliaries huddled together, their faces pale masks of terror. They did not look at the American soldiers standing guard. They looked at the ground. In the final weeks of the war, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine had screamed a single, terrifying message: victory or Bolshevism. But for those facing the Western Allies, the message was more insidious. They were told the Americans were gangsters, distinct from the Soviets, but equally barbaric servants of a vengeful Jewish conspiracy who would enact the Morgenthau Plan to turn Germany into a pastoral wasteland. They were told to expect starvation, interrogation, and for the women, the same industrial-scale sexual violence that was currently consuming Berlin in the East. Helga waited for the shout, the strike of a rifle butt, or the hand grabbing her wrist. She expected to be stripped, shaved, and thrown into a pit to rot. Instead, a young American MP with a helmet tilted casually back on his head walked up to the group. He didn't scream. He didn't unholster his weapon. He looked tired. "All right, ladies," he said, his voice flat but not unkind, gesturing toward a large tent. "Let's get you out of the rain. Chow is in 20 minutes. Helga blinked. She knew enough English to understand rain and chow, but the concepts didn't fit. Chow food. For prisoners. It was a trick. It had to be a trick. The weapon of abundance, the torture Helga expected, was physical. The torture she actually encountered was psychological, and it began inside the mess tent. It was the smell that hit them first. It wasn't the smell of Ersatz coffee substitute made from chicory and grain, or the sour tang of watery cabbage soup that had sustained the Reich for the last 2 years. It was the rich, dark, unmistakable aroma of real coffee. Helga stood in line, her metal tray shaking in her hands. When she reached the servers, she braced herself for a meager ladle of gruel. Instead, a ladle heavily laden with meat stew was dumped onto her tray. Real meat. Chunks of beef swimming in a thick gravy. Next to it a scoop of powdered eggs that looked like gold, but the item that shattered her composure was the bread. It was a slice of American white bread. To the Germans, accustomed to the dense, dark, sawdust-filled Kriegsbrat war bread, this square of fluff looked like cake. It was impossibly white, impossibly soft. She sat down at a long wooden table, surrounded by her silent comrades. No one ate at first. They stared at the food as if it were a hallucination. Was it poisoned? Was this a last meal before execution? Then, an older nurse across from her broke off a piece of the white bread and put it in her mouth. She closed her eyes, and tears began to stream silently down her cheeks. It wasn't just the taste, it was what the taste represented. Germany had been told it was fighting a war for survival against degenerates. They were the master race, spiritually superior to the mongrel nations of the West. Yet, here were their captors, casually handing out luxuries that the Reich hadn't seen since 1939 to their prisoners. If the Americans could feed their enemies better than Hitler could feed his own soldiers, the war wasn't just lost militarily, it was lost totally. The material abundance on that tray did more to dismantle Helga's Nazi indoctrination than any lecture ever could. It proved that the decadent democracy was actually an industrial juggernaut capable of terrifying logistics. The shock of dignity, the physical abundance, was disorienting, but the social interaction was dismantling. German nurses like Ilse Schultz and Greet Fock, captured in North Africa and Italy earlier in the war, had already documented this phenomenon. But for the wave of women captured in 1945, the contrast was sharper. They were coming from a Germany that was collapsing into apocalyptic ruin. In the American field hospitals where some captured nurses were put to work, the culture shock was absolute. In the Wehrmacht, discipline was rigid, hierarchical, and often brutal. A doctor was a god. A nurse was a servant. In the American sector, Helga watched with wide eyes as a U.S. Army doctor, a major, asked a sergeant for a cigarette. The sergeant didn't snap to attention or tremble. He just fished a pack of Lucky Strikes out of his pocket and tossed it to the officer. They joked. They laughed. Where is the discipline? She thought. How can an army function like this? And yet, it functioned beautifully. The hospital was a machine of efficiency. The supplies were endless. She watched American medics discard half-used rolls of sterile bandages, items that German surgeons would have washed and reused until they fell apart. She saw them use penicillin, the miracle drug that Germany had failed to mass-produce, as if it were water. But the most unsettling aspect was how the Americans treated her. One afternoon, Helga was changing the dressing of a wounded German POW. An American GI recovering in the next bed watched her. She stiffened, expecting a slur or a jeer. "Hey sister," the GI called out. She froze. "Yes." He held out a chocolate bar, a Hershey's bar. "You look like you need this more than I do." Helga stared at the chocolate. In Germany, chocolate was currency. It bought silence. It bought favors. It bought sex. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice hard, defensive. She had been warned about what men wanted. The GI looked confused. "I don't want nothing. Just take it. It's a chocolate bar, not a grenade." She took it. She didn't thank him. She was too confused to speak. Later, Hiding in the latrine, she ate it in small, frantic bites. It was sweet, rich, and overwhelming. This was the kindness that shattered them. If the American soldiers had beaten them, it would have confirmed everything Goebbels had said. It would have allowed them to remain martyrs, victims of a barbarian horde. But by treating them with casual indifference or occasional generosity, the Americans denied them their martyrdom. They weren't untermensch to these GIs, they were just people. And that realized humanity forced the German nurses to look in the mirror. If these gangsters were actually decent men, then what were the men Helga had been supporting? What was the regime she had served? The golden cage. As the weeks turned into months, the nurses were moved to larger camps, some even shipped to the United States to work in POW wards. The experience became known among them as the golden cage. They had hot showers, they had soap that lapped, they had sanitary napkins, a luxury that had all but vanished in Germany. They had access to books and magazines. In the evenings, the nurses would gather in their barracks. The fanaticism of the early days began to dissolve. The Heil Hitlers stopped. The discussions shifted from the glory of the Reich to the sheer undeniable reality of the world outside Germany. They read American newspapers, often provided by camp re-education officers, but also just left lying around. They saw photos of New York untouched by bombs. They saw the advertisements for cars, refrigerators, and nylons. They realized that while they had been eating turnip soup and huddled in cellars, America had been building a world of plenty. The propaganda had told them the US was weak, corrupted by jazz and racial mixing. But Helga saw that this corruption looked a lot like freedom. The black soldiers, though segregated by their own army, a paradox Helga noted, walked with a swagger and were fed better than a German general. The Jewish doctors she encountered were skilled, professional, and treated her with a cool detachment that was far more devastating than anger. One specific account from a captured nurse, recorded in oral histories, tells of a moment when she was asked to assist in a surgery on an American soldier. She was terrified that if the soldier died, she would be executed for sabotage. The surgery was difficult. The soldier survived. Afterward, the American surgeon took off his mask, looked at her and said, "Good work, nurse, good work. Not, you did your duty for the state." Just a professional acknowledgement of competence. It gave her back a piece of her identity that the Nazis had subsumed into the collective. She wasn't a vessel for the Aryan race. She was a nurse. The return, when the time came for repatriation, the transition was jarring. Returning to a Germany that was a smoking crater of rubble, divided and starving, was a shock in reverse. Helga returned to a Hamburg that no longer existed. The streets were canyons of masonry. The people were gaunt, hollow-eyed, scrounging for cigarette butts to trade for bread. She carried with her a few items she had saved from the camp, a bar of soap, a pair of stockings, and a few packs of gum. But she also carried something heavier, the burden of truth. When she met her former neighbors, they spoke with venom about the enemy. They clung to the old lies because they had nothing else. But Helga couldn't join in. "They aren't monsters," she whispered to her mother one night, sharing a piece of the hoarded chocolate. "Don't say that," her mother hissed, looking at the door. "They destroyed everything." "They destroyed the army," Helga corrected. "But they fed me. They treated me like a human being when they didn't have to." The tragedy of the German nurses captured in 1945 wasn't that they suffered, it was that they were shown a vision of a world that didn't require suffering to function. They had been prepared to die for a lie, and instead they were forced to live with the truth. The torture they expected would have hardened their resolve. The kindness they received dissolved it. It left them with a profound sense of betrayal, not by the Americans, but by their own leaders who had convinced them that the light was darkness and that abundance was a sin. Years later, many of these women would look back on their time in the American camps not as a period of imprisonment, but as the time they woke up. The white bread, the hot water, and the hello sister were the weapons that finally ended the war in their minds.